Okay, well, hello. My name is Ariel Bonkoski. I am the owner of Ariel's Mushroom Co. I have been studying wild mushroom identification and foraging since 2016. I started teaching other people about those topics in 2019 and then starting my business, formally teaching in 2021. Um, I mentioned my focus is very much in identification and foraging. I kind of fell into this on accident. I was never really much of a nature person growing up, but I thought mushrooms were beautiful, and I kind of fell in love just through the beauty of mushrooms. And I really hope to get other people excited about what's out there as far as our wild mushrooms. I do work with lots of schools and nature centers, teaching classes. I also do some volunteer-based identification through a organization that has about 300 to 400 identifiers for plants and mushrooms worldwide, where we identify things for emergency consumption situations. So like doctors in emergency rooms or poison control will reach out to us, or veterinarians will reach out to us. So I do a lot of work with that kind of stuff. I've got a little presentation for you guys, just to hopefully kind of pique your interest into wild mushrooms. I'm unfortunately not going to make you a foraging expert in this short amount of time, but hopefully you're at least interested in exploring more after this. I am going to share my screen here and get going. Let's see. All right. All right. So presentation's very simple, just titled Wild Mushrooms 101. We're just going to talk about really basic information today. So first off, what is a mushroom? A mushroom is the reproductive fruiting body of a fungus. And then a fungus is a network of fine filaments known as mycelium that usually lives in soil or wood. You can kind of think of mycelium as like a tree and the mushrooms as an apple. Mushrooms are really just that fruiting body of a larger organism. And we don't often see the larger organism just because it's so mixed up in the soil or wood, but it is there. Now, not all fungus produces mushrooms. There's things like molds or even toe fungus. It'd be really weird if mushrooms grew from our toes. And then just a little fun fact that mushrooms or fungi used to be considered a plant until 1969, and then it got moved into its own kingdom. Now, just learning how to describe your mushrooms is going to be really helpful when you're trying to identify your mushrooms. Mushrooms can have so many different features, but this graph just kind of shows some of the common features. There are mushrooms out there that aren't going to have any of these features here. These are just some common ones, and I'm just going to briefly describe them, working my way bottom up. And just a heads up, I didn't make this graph, so don't judge me on the spelling error on it, but it is a good graph. So at the bottom here, we have our mycelial threads. Now, we mentioned mushrooms are not plants, so they don't have roots. Instead, they have that mycelium that connects into that fruiting body. Now, sometimes mushrooms, when you pluck them from the ground, they're going to have what looks like roots, and those are just the mycelial threads. It's just a thicker part of the mycelium. Now, not all mushrooms have those visible mycelial threads, so if you are seeing that, that's important to note. Then some mushrooms will actually start growing from like an egg or like a ball shape. And eventually that ball shape will open up and the rest of the mushroom will emerge. So that egg or that ball is called a basal bulb. Sometimes also called a universal veil is another term for that. Now, when that basal bulb opens up, that opening is called the vulva. And then for mushrooms, we usually don't use the term stem. Instead, we use the term stipe or stalk. And now on that stipe or stalk, you can see so many different features. You could see scales, you would see a reticulum, which is kind of like a fish netting pattern, or you could see a ring or a skirt. I am going to circle back to this ring or skirt feature in just a moment because it does have relevance to some other features. Um, then we've got our underside of the mushroom, and that's where most mushrooms will release their spores, which will help it to reproduce. Now, on that underside, we could see things like gills, which is usually what we think of when we think of a mushroom. It has gills on the underside, which are kind of like individual blade-like structures. We could see teeth on the underside of that mushroom. We could see pores. Now, some pores can be more sponge-like, or sometimes they can be more like individual tubes that are tightly packed together. And then we've got our cap of the mushrooms. So you could see things like an areole, which is kind of like a crackly pattern. You could see zonations, or like concentric rings. You could see scales. You could see warts, not rats. Or you could see striations, which gives a mushroom kind of like a pleated look, like a pleated skirt. And I said I'd mention this ring or skirt again. Now, that ring or skirt is typically kind of fleshy, or it can be kind of more cobwebby in texture most commonly. But it can hang, or it can actually go upwards. Actually noting if it goes upwards or is hanging can be helpful when identifying too. But wherever it's, pointing up or down, that edge of it, where it's not connected to the stipe, is actually there because at one time that edge was connected to the edge of the cap. So when that is actually still connected, that's called a veil, because when it's connected, it's covering up the true underside of a mushroom. So it's going to cover up the gills or pores or teeth, whatever that true underside of the mushroom is. So if you ever pick a mushroom and it's kind of just like fleshy or cobwebby and it's not really showing any gills or pores or teeth, you actually might want to just poke your thumb through and see what the actual true underside of that mushroom looks like. Now, when you are trying to identify a mushroom, quite literally every single feature is important. So you want to make note of the color of the cap and underside, any color or texture pattern on the cap. What kind of wood is it growing from or near? And is that wood dead or alive? Note the size, shape, and pattern of the underside, whether it be gills, pores, or teeth. If it has a stipe, and what the color or texture of that is. What is the growth pattern? Is it growing singularly, clustered, shelf-like, in a rosette pattern? Does any part of the mushroom bruise? If so, what color? To bruise a mushroom, you just squeeze or pinch the different features and see if they change colors. Sometimes bruising is instant. Sometimes bruising takes up to an hour. So might be worth sticking around to see if it bruises. What season is this mushroom growing in? A lot of mushrooms are very season specific. If you've ever heard of a mushroom called hen of the woods, that is a very late summer / fall species, but it does have a lookalike that occurs late spring, early summer. So if it's June 14th and you think you found hen of the woods, you've found the lookalike. What is the overall size of the specimen? Some mushrooms are very small and have very large lookalikes, or vice versa. Now, when you know that you have an edible mushroom and you want to harvest it and take it home to eat, here's how I think you should do it. You can cut or pluck your mushroom, it does not matter, but I do suggest trimming off any super dirty spots if you've got a mushroom knife or even a pocket knife. This is going to help prevent dirt from getting all over your harvest and will save you tons of cleaning time later. If you're just plucking mushrooms and they've got a bunch of dirt stuck onto the base of that and you're just throwing it in your mushroom basket or whatnot, you get home and that dirt has found its way in between all the gills or pores and everything, and it gets very difficult to clean when it gets to that point. Avoid harvesting from areas treated with pesticides or other chemicals. Avoid harvesting from treated lumber or even nearby busy roads or highways. And then just be aware not to damage the environment around you. Avoid trampling, damaging trees. Try to follow the leave no trace policy the best you can, which you should be practicing anytime you're in the woods. And then a little bit about mushroom edibility. Edible means it can safely be consumed. Toxic means this could have health-related consequences. Non-edible means in most cases that the species is not eaten due to things like flavor or texture. Unknown edibility means we don't know if that mushroom can be safely consumed. And we usually only see unknown edibility when mushrooms are like so small, they're not even worth thinking about trying to eat, or if it's a very rare species that we just haven't studied enough. Now, just because a mushroom is considered edible does not mean there is zero risk. Some people can have personal sensitivities to all mushrooms or even just specific species, even if the mushroom is considered a safe edible mushroom. These sensitivities can develop over time for some people. It is more frequent with certain species. So if you've ever heard of morels, which is a really common one, or chicken of the woods, with those two species specifically, a lot of people can eat them for years and years and years and years with no problem. And one day they go to their patch they've harvested from for many years and they go home and cook them up and they get really sick. And I think that's really odd. They'll think that's really odd, and they'll try again maybe the following week in a completely different meal, and they'll have the same result and the same result. And science does not know why this happens, but it does happen, and it is more frequent with certain species, but it can happen to any species. It is still pretty uncommon that it happens, but just know that it can happen. Now, to avoid any possible sickness, cook your wild mushrooms well and start with small amounts if it's a new to you mushroom. Some people suggest, if you find a mushroom that you've never eaten before, maybe fry up like 2 bites worth of that mushroom, eat it, and give it 24 hours. If you're still feeling good the next day, go ahead and make your larger meal with the rest of the mushrooms. I would say that's probably overcautious, but if you are someone that's prone to like allergic reactions, or if you naturally have very sensitive stomach or something like that, maybe that is a safer route for you. But in general, I would say it is a little bit overcautious. Do not eat a mushroom unless you are 100% sure of the identification, of course. I do recommend getting additional confirmations of your identifications from an expert if you can. I will leave my email up at the end of this presentation, so you guys are always welcome to email me with ID confirmations or any other questions. Again, avoid eating mushrooms from areas that could have toxin exposures, avoid nearby roads. Also avoid mushrooms that are like naturally dried out. If you find them, they're already dehydrated, probably avoid those. If they're past prime, if they're moldy, a lot of people get really excited because they've found this mushroom that they've been searching for forever and they want to eat it, but there's mold on it and they try to, kind of disregard that. Please don't eat moldy mushrooms. I know you're excited to find them. Now, I'm just going to talk about some of my favorite common edibles in the Midwest. So first up, I've got the oysters. These are super common all over the country. Oysters are kind of a great beginner mushroom. They occur spring through fall on hardwoods, living and dead. They typically grow in shelf-like clusters. If they are growing more on top of a log, they can be more circular. You can kind of see that in this first image here. The cap is usually, excuse me, I just losing my spot here. The cap is usually kidney or fan-shaped unless it's circular growing on top of the wood. The cap can be pearly white to a little bit brownish and can be bald in texture. Now it's going to have white gills that run down the stipe and can get a little bit yellowish with age. You can see a little bit of that yellowing here. The stipe is often, it's quite short. Sometimes you can't always tell that a stipe is there at all because it's so short. So if you're not able to tell if it does have a stipe or not, I recommend giving a squeeze on the mushroom where it connects to the wood. And if it's feeling very dense and kind of tougher in there, that's just going to be the stipe kind of hidden in that. This is a very meaty mushroom. You can actually usually find these in grocery stores. Um, they're very, very good edible to try. They do have a fair amount of lookalikes, so I do recommend getting familiar with their lookalikes if you're going to forage for them. But this is a great starter mushroom. Next, we have our golden chanterelles, which is one of my absolute favorites. Um, these are just kind of these yellowish golden mushrooms that have a stipe and what they call false gills. And these mushrooms grow terrestrially summer through fall. Now, these false gills are actually still gills, but they're just going to be more vein-like rather than blade-like. And what that kind of means is with most mushrooms that have regular gills, if you were to kind of run your thumb through those gills, kind of just like running your thumb through pages in a book. They're going to move like pages in a book and take their place after, your thumb releases them. If you were to run your thumb through the gills of a chanterelle, they're not going to move because they're just more vein-like. And if you're applying enough pressure to make them move, they're just going to break and crumble. They shouldn't move with just a casual running your thumb through the gills. Now, these false gills can have kind of like a forking pattern, meaning they split off in different directions, and they are going to run a little bit down the stipe, not a whole lot, just a little bit. Now, the stipe is often the same color as the cap and gills, but sometimes the stipe and the gills can be more of a creamy whitish color rather than golden. And that's just because we have several different species that grow in the Midwest. I want to say the last number I heard was 9 species of our golden chanterelles in the Midwest. So just because there's several different species, they have a little bit of variability. And that mostly shows in the color of the gills and stipe. You can see the gills and stipe here are much more creamy than this specimen here. Those are different species, but they are still considered golden chanterelles. Now, the caps are going to be smooth on top, and they're usually going to have a depressed center, meaning it just dips in the center a little bit. And a fun thing about these that is actually a fun identification characteristic is they peel like string cheese. So if you find what you think is a chanterelle, giving it a peel is actually a good way to try to identify it because it peels exactly like string cheese. Because there are several different species of golden chanterelles, you will see some books that say just the golden chanterelles will smell like apricots. In my experience, that's very specific to only a handful of our golden chanterelle species. Not all of our golden chanterelle species are going to smell like apricots, but if they do smell like apricots, that's a good identification characteristic for some of our golden chanterelles. Now, this does have a few lookalikes as well, but those veiny gills really sets it apart from most of its lookalikes. So making note of that is very important. Next up is the lobster mushroom. This is actually the mushroom that kind of got me going into the mushroom world. And I very strongly believe that if it was any other mushroom that I was able to first find and identify myself, I don't think I would have gotten as into it just because this mushroom is kind of just a really interesting weirdo, honestly. So the lobster mushroom is actually a parasitic fungus that attacks another mushroom. So the top 2 photos are actually what we call our lobster mushroom. The bottom 2 photos is actually the host mushroom. So that's what it looked like before it got infected with the parasitic fungus. That parasitic fungus turned it into this weird orangey blob. Now, the host mushroom in this photo is Lactarius pipperatus. I think they call it a pepper milky is like one of the common names because it's a very peppery mushroom. And it's actually considered inedible because of its flavor. And I wouldn't necessarily call it peppery. I have tasted it before, and it is kind of more like a chemically wasabi. It's not a pleasant spice at all. Um, but it is considered inedible just because of that unpleasant flavor. This mushroom's the host mushroom, the pepper milky, is actually also very, it's kind of like a crumbly mushroom, so it's kind of delicate. It breaks apart super easy. Um, but when that parasitic fungus comes and attacks that host mushroom, it completely eliminates the spice and gives it a very mild, subtle seafood flavor, actually, hence the lobster mushroom. Um, and it actually turns it into a very dense mushroom. So when it's a lobster mushroom, these top two photos, it almost, when they're fresh, it kind of has like the density of like a fresh red potato. It's very dense, but when it's the host mushroom, it's very fragile, very light, breaks apart super easy. So it completely changes the mushroom, turns it colors. It actually will solidify the gills, so you're not going to see any gills on the underside of the lobster mushroom. Um, these grow terrestrially in summer through fall. And usually when you find one, there's going to be a bunch more in the area, which makes this a fun mushroom to find because you usually find a lot of them. They actually smell somewhat fishy, especially as it ages. You will know when you are walking past a rotting lobster mushroom because it will smell like a fish market. It is not the most pleasant thing, but when they are fresh, it's a nice, very subtle seafood scent, very subtle seafood flavor. Um, this is definitely one of my favorite mushrooms to cook with. Then we've got our lion's mane and siblings. So we have 3 species of Hericium that grow in the Midwest here. The first one is lion's mane, which is the most commonly known one. That grows singularly or in pairs on living oaks, and it's basically just a non-branching clump of dangling white spines. Next one, we've got bear's head. Some people call it bear's head's tooth. It doesn't matter. The only image I could find that showed the 3 comparison had the tooth scribbled out. I don't know why, but bear's head's tooth is very accepted name for this. But the bear's head tooth grows singularly or near others on dead hardwood or from wounds of living hardwood. And it's basically just a white branching mass with tightly packed dangling spines. And then we've got our coral tooth, which is what I find the most of here in the Midwest. And that grows singularly or near others on dead hardwoods. And that is basically like just white branches that aren't so tightly packed. So the coral tooth and bear's head look most similarly to each other. And it's really just about how dense the teeth are packed together. So sometimes they kind of fall in that gray area, but as long as you know that it's one of these two, you're good to go. All of these occur summer through fall. And the good thing about these is they really don't have many lookalikes. Really, if you just make note that none of these species develop a cap that will eliminate a lot of lookalikes. And then additionally, if you note that all of the spines go downwards, that eliminates a lot of coral mushrooms that always grow upwards. So making note that it has no cap and all the teeth dangle is very important. But these actually have a very, as far as their like flavor and texture and things like that, I think they're kind of comparable a little bit to crab meat. Like if you were to merge a mushroom with crab meat, that is what these are. So you'll find like a lot of like lion's mane crab cake recipes online, and they are so good. That is how I tend to make any 3 of these species when I find them. That's usually my go-to recipe, is making lion's mane crab cakes because they are delicious. Now, there are a few toxic mushrooms to know about. First, there's the destroying angel, Amanita bisporigera. Now, this is actually a species complex. There's about 6 species in the Midwest that look identical, do the same thing. So we just call it the Amanita bisporigera complex, but they're all destroying angels. These are all white mushrooms that grow terrestrially, often near others, not often near oaks or other hardwoods, summer through fall. And they have a pearly white cap that starts kind of oval shaped and will flatten out with age. They're going to have white gills, The stipe will be slightly shaggy or even bald. It's going to have a white basal bulb that likes to hide underground a bit. So this starts as an egg shape, and then that egg will open up and the rest of the mushroom will emerge out of that. You can see how dirt covered these basal bulbs are, so you can see that they were definitely in the ground a bit. Now, these are deadly. These will cause liver or kidney failure. I mentioned that I did some volunteer emergency identifications with a team. And we, I want to say 2.5 years ago, had a pretty big case where a mother had reached out to us, I believe Georgia or Alabama, and her 3-year-old daughter had gotten a hold of these out of the yard and had consumed one. She had immediately brought her daughter to the ER. They needed to know what the mushroom was so they could treat properly. We identified the mushroom as the destroying angel, and she relayed that information to her doctor. Her doctor said, well, she's not showing symptoms, so we're going to release her. What the doctor didn't understand about the toxin in this mushroom is that if you were to consume it, what happens is you are going to feel just fine for a couple days. And then you're going to feel absolutely terrible for a few days. You're going to spend a lot of time in the bathroom, to put it lightly, but then you're going to start feeling better after another couple days, and then you're going to go downhill again. So this mushroom actually takes about a week or more to kill you. It will slowly shut down your organs. So you won't initially show symptoms after consuming this. So when the doctor said, well, she's not showing symptoms, we're going to send her home, we obviously urge the mother to stay at the hospital, let him know what this toxin is and what it does. They need to treat now, because if they treat early, there's less invasive ways to get through, the poisoning. But if you were to wait, then you need an organ transplant. And basically the doctor was refusing to do anything. So we had to tell this mother to drive her daughter to the next nearest hospital, which was about 3 hours away from them. And you can bet we wrote some letters to the medical board about that doctor, because that was a very scary day for all of us. If you've ever had to have a conversation with a mother whose daughter just ate something that could kill them, it's a very scary situation. So this is a very scary mushroom. There is not many edible lookalikes to this mushroom, except for when it is still in that basal bulb stage before the mushroom emerges. It could be confused as a puffball mushroom, which most puffball mushrooms are edible. I wish I could have enough time to cover puffball identification, but that is really the only edible lookalike to this mushroom. We really don't see a lot of human consumption cases with this mushroom in our country, so that is a good thing. Next, we have our deadly Galerina. Now, that occurs on hardwoods and conifers year-round, sometimes growing in clusters or individually. The cap is going to be sticky or tacky and bell-shaped when young, but will flatten out with age. The gills are going to be kind of yellowish and will fade to like a rusty brownish with age due to the spore color. The spores will stick to the gills and make them look a different color. Now, the stipe is going to be whitish to brownish with white fibrils and a very delicate ring. It is very hard to see in this photo, but there is a subtle ring on this mushroom. Now, I mentioned earlier, rings are usually kind of fleshy or cobwebby. This is kind of in between. It's more like tissue paper. It's very delicate. So because this mushroom's ring is very delicate, it will often like wash away in the rain. So you might not always see a ring on this mushroom. Now, this is a deadly mushroom. There are not many deaths associated with this mushroom, though. It does seem that you would probably need to eat a lot in order to actually die from it, but it will still poison you if you eat it. You will have a very bad time, spending a lot of time in the bathroom. So you definitely don't want to consume that. There are not many edible lookalikes. The big edible lookalike would be a honey mushroom, which has a completely different cap texture and is actually quite a bit larger. So there is some significant differences there. Now, I do have some suggested books for our region. If you are just looking to casually get into this and not super dive in, I will recommend this first book listed here, which is this mini book, this very, very small book with the kind of tealish cover. That actually has an updated version. The updated version has more of a maroonish cover instead of that teal. I have the old copy. But if you are like really looking to dive into mushroom identification, then I would recommend getting the other books. But if you're just looking to keep this casual, the first book here is going to be just fine for you. Um, I do include the tree book here just because tree identification will help with your mushroom identification, but you don't need to be a tree expert to be a good mushroom identification person. So I do like to include that though. All right. That is what I have for you today. If you've got any questions, please ask. You've got my email here as well, so you're welcome to email me at a later time.
Anyone have any questions? Ariel, do you grow any mushrooms? Or do you
I do
just
not
wild?
cultivate mushrooms. It's been something that I like have had on my list of things to do for the longest time and just haven't gotten to it yet. I do have some great books on it. If you are interested in cultivating, I do suggest Tavis Lynch has a cultivation book, and I do recommend that book.
And you said that was Davis Lynch, Lynch?
Tavis Lynch, Tavis, and then Lynch, Lynch.
The trees foraging for, are they found or associated with trees?
Did you hear that, Ariel?
I did not hear that.
You could come up.
Are most of the mushrooms that you're foraging for associated with trees or found near trees? Is that
So a lot of
typically?
our edible mushrooms are in some sort of association with trees. There are some that aren't. So like giant puffballs, you'll usually find those in fields, like grassy fields. But most of our mushrooms, as far as edible mushrooms, are going to associate with usually trees. And that they could be growing directly on the tree, or they could be, feeding from the roots of the tree essentially, but they will have some sort of association with the tree, most of them.
I noticed you didn't have morels on your list.
So yeah, actually, morels, this kind of surprises people, but morels aren't actually one of my favorite edibles. I think they're a little boring. But where I am in the Midwest, we actually don't really get morels. So I'm in Duluth, Minnesota, and because of kind of like the lake effect and everything, we don't get the right tree species. We don't get um you know, we don't get the tree species we need to get a lot of morels. We can find them where I'm at, but it's super, super, super rare. Um, so I don't have actually that much experience with morels just because they don't really grow in my area. I have to travel like 2 to 3 hours to find them.
Could you go back to the reference slide so they can grab a picture of that of the books?
Yes, absolutely. And I will say, the pocket guide I've got here, this Mushrooms of the Upper Midwest, that good beginner book, um, that is a very, very easy to use book, but it is pretty limited. You can see how small it is compared to the other books in the photo. So usually when I don't find what I need in that book, I then find it in this book above it, this North American Mushrooms book. So that's a great supplement book specifically for the smaller guide.
Okay, we have a question. Ariel, why did you say check on the bruising of the mushrooms?
Just because it can help with identification. So I know I didn't cover this mushroom in the presentation, but there's a mushroom called hen of the woods, which is a very common edible mushroom. It does have a look-alike, though, called a black staining polypore. And one of the big differences is the black staining polypore bruises black, while hen of the woods does not bruise at all. So it just can help you with your identification to just try bruising a mushroom to see if it does bruise, what the color of the bruising is. It's just going to help you identify your mushrooms.
I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone.